Hello adventurers, this is Bryant, your Dungeon Master. I'm back with another Session 0 video for the Corvian Pale campaign. This time, I'm going to talk about the world of Genosha itself. One of the things that a lot of Dungeon Masters find is, once they start running things, they want to create their own world. I don't know exactly what the reason for this impetus is, but it seems to be common among a lot of game masters. I think part of it is not wanting to have to learn a lot about a pre-existing campaign that's been written, such as Forgotten Realms or Kryn or whatever else it may be. But I think it's also because it gives you a lot of room to play, a lot of room to create whatever you have in mind. That's what I wanted out of Genosha when I first created it several years ago for my first campaign. And to be honest, I knew Kryn fairly well from reading the novels of Dragonlance when I was in middle school and high school. I knew at least a little bit about a few of the other worlds. So part of it was that I didn't feel familiar enough with those to necessarily feel comfortable running them. But also I just like the idea that I could start up a world and have complete freedom to do whatever I wanted, put things wherever I wanted, create completely whole cloth NPCs that will be interesting and tell the stories that I wanted to tell. Does that mean that Genosha is a super original or, particularly interesting world? Not necessarily. In a lot of ways, it really is just a standard sort of fantasy role-playing world. That said, it's my standard fantasy role-playing world, and that means that I get to play around in it in any way that I want to, along with, of course, my players. Now, for some of the basics of the world of Genosha, they do follow, again, some of the rules or the outlines that you might see as taken as sort of standard in the D&D world books. So, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it talks about some of the assumptions that they made when they talk about the setting. And a lot of these work for me as well in Genosha. One of those that leaps to the forefront is that the world is ancient, and the world of Genosha is very old. No one really knows for sure how old it is. The elves, of course, and a few of the other races that are longer lived, such as the dwarves, will claim to know the true and full history of the world. But even they were not there when the world was first created, so whatever their histories may be, it doesn't necessarily mean that they know the truth of all of it. For the most part, especially from the perspective of the shorter-lived races like humans, most of that ancient history is unknown. It's lost to the sands of time because their record keeping, their histories going that far back, they just are incomplete or non-existent. In addition, the world is a magical place, but it's not what I would call a high-level magic campaign. There's magic that's there. A lot of it is embedded in the world. But from a player perspective, it's going to be the things that you encounter, the items that you find, the ancient ruins that you uncover. It's not going to be a high saturation of magic in the world to the point that you might find in something such as Eberron. So there is no magic economy. There is no shop on the corner where you can go and buy a +1 sword or even necessarily healing potions. There may be some alchemists in the world who create potions and even sell them, but they're not going to be present in every village in the land. The gods. Now, this is a question that, let's just say, isn't fully known, because there are a number of gods. Religion is very important to the people of Genosha. However, no one can say necessarily for sure which gods are real, which gods are the correct gods. Because each of the major races has their own gods, their own pantheon that they follow, and some of the societies have adopted gods of other people, and then you even have religions out there such as the Church of Terra, which says that Terra is the only god. There are no other gods except for Terra, and so anyone else is just a blasphemer who is praying to false idols. That said, in the world of Genosha, the dominant culture is Devonaria, which follows the Caltheran pantheon, which is a large and broad pantheon that started out as the 7 major gods of humanity in the region where they started. But Devonaria is a large and diverse empire, and they absorbed the religions of other people who came into them. And so there are any number of gods, large and small, that are worshipped within that pantheon, including gods from other races, such as Corvian, who is an elven god, is part of the Caltheran pantheon. The world is one that at times has been more tamed, but now has become less civilized as a result of a number of things that have happened, including the Devonarian Civil War. So with the aftermath of that war, the empire has contracted somewhat, even in the lands that it controls. And so the wild things, the wild places of the world are growing, and there's a bit more chaos. So let me step back and talk briefly. Genosha, let's break that down as far as the hierarchy. Genosha is the name of the world. It's the name of the planet, but it's the name of the world as a general place. Calthera is the name of the continent. It's a large continent in the northern hemisphere, and for a long time, for hundreds of years, Devonaria was the empire that controlled most, if not all, of that continent. That was not always the case. Other kingdoms and empires and city-states have risen and fallen throughout the history of the world, but Devonaria, which started as a single city, Devonor, hundreds of years prior, had grown such that it ruled almost all of the continent. Now, the time period that this game is going to take place, that world has been split apart, and the world is going through a major period of upheaval because a number of the eastern provinces of the empire were unhappy. They felt that the empire was corrupt, that they were paying higher taxes and not seeing anything out of it. There were barbarians that were invading from some of those areas that Devonaria did not really have a firm grip on. And so basically these provinces banded together, declared an alliance, and declared their independence, essentially. And that led to the Civil War. In the eastern provinces, this was called the Liberation Wars, and in Devonaria itself, this was called the Sundering. And this was an enormous war that lasted for somewhere around 50 years. And finally, when the current young emperor took the throne, the war had been going so badly, and so at best of times for recent years, it had been a stalemate. But things were very much in favor of the eastern provinces, and when this new young emperor took the throne, partly due to what he had seen growing up, partly due to pressure from his counselors, he agreed to sue for peace. And so the Treaty of Inchen's Palace was signed, and unfortunately for Devonaria, they had to let go a great number of the eastern provinces. This took about a third to a half of the amount of land and people that Devonaria controlled. And so that, combined with 2 generations long war, meant that the Empire is really struggling now and sort of recouping and figuring out where they are, where they stand. One of the things that was also a result of that war was that all of the slaves that had been living in Devonaria were declared free. This is really important. We dial it back, when Devonaria was expanding, there was a neighboring empire called Arcosia. Arcosia was the empire of the Dragonborn. And the Dragonborn at one point had their own very mighty empire, but they had fallen into decay. They had fallen into corruption and infighting, and they were weak. And Devonaria at that time took advantage of it. They invaded, they took over Arcosia, and the Dragonborn were essentially enslaved. Now, to be clear, this is more of a Egyptian, Roman sort of slavery versus the American slavery that we have. But it was still largely race-based, and it was still obviously really terrible. Throughout the course of the Empire, the Dragonborn had risen up several times and not completely won their freedom. And so when the Civil War started, the Dragonborn were very quickly to once again rise up to fight alongside the eastern provinces. And as a condition of the peace treaty, the Dragonborn were all freed. And they were given their own land, which was the province that was the central core of what used to be Arcosia. They renamed the capital Liberacus, and now they have a republic that is sort of in the heart of the continent, right along the border of Devonaria itself. Many Dragonborn have relocated to this new homeland of theirs, but many have stayed where they were, including within Devonaria. And it's not a case where every Dragonborn hates every human, but it is a complicated relationship in many ways. One thing that the Dragonborn will find is that they have a lot in common with dwarves, actually. In addition to their commitment to their families and their martial prowess, which both races share, the dwarves, many people outside of dwarven culture do not know this, but the dwarves were enslaved by the giants early in the history of the world, and they toiled for them for many years. They built any number of structures and monuments for the giants, and that's one reason why the dwarves still hate giants and still hate the orcs, who were the servants of the giants. So dwarves still hate those races, and in general they hate slavery. And so there were a number of dwarves over the years during the time of Devonaria that fought against that in various ways, and in many cases tried to help the Dragonborn to escape to freedom. And so there is a sort of kinship between those two races for that reason. As for some of the other races, they follow a lot of the expectations you might have. One thing that I will say is important to note is in Genosha, elves and Eladrin are sort of cousins. They're essentially the same race, but at one time the plane of the Shadowfell and the plane of the Feywild were directly connected to the world as we know it, as Genosha knows it. And after a time, those worlds split apart, and there are only a few places where they still touch over onto the main world that most people live in. That is the genesis of the High Elves, or the Eladrin, and the Elves, or the Wood Elves as they might be called. So they were one race. The Eladrin were the ones who primarily stayed in the Feywild. The Elves were the ones who primarily stayed in the material plane. And so while there are still Eladrin and even Eladrin societies, Eladrin communities, Eladrin cities in Genosha, they still feel more connected to the Feywild, whereas the elves themselves feel more connected to the nature of the Prime world. Another important difference or specialty of the races of this world is the nature of halflings. And so many people will think of halflings as being very much homebodies, as loving home and hearth and food and family and community. And that's very much true for many halflings. But there are some who have this insatiable wanderlust, and they long ago formed these communities of traveling people. And so they actually travel in these caravans of brightly painted wagons, and they go all over the continent. Some of them have very small routes, some of them have long routes that stretch, almost from ocean to ocean. And it depends on the tribe, it depends on the group as to what their route is, how large they are. But they basically go from town to town, village to village, and they're traders, they're tinkers, they are performers, they are bards, they are storytellers, and they are fortune tellers. And so their reaction, of course, varies from place to place. There's some who view them with suspicion, possibly as thieves or troublemakers. But for the most part, they tend to be welcome because they bring news, they bring information, they bring stories, they bring entertainment, and they bring trade goods that they may not, in some of these small remote places that they visit, they may not get very often. So that's a very important piece for understanding halflings, that there are two sort of different types. I'm going to talk now about the results of the Civil War, which, as I said, it's just been about 1.5 to 2 years since the treaty was signed, and the world is still adjusting to this peace that has only been existing for a few years after so long of being constantly at war. Obviously, that's going to have a drastic effect on everyone, and it's going to leave a world that is kind of struggling to figure out how to adjust to this, and how to adjust to a difference in power structure where the empire is still very large, very powerful, very wealthy, but it is not what it once was. Now, our story takes place in Devonaria. That doesn't mean that everyone who is there, all of your characters, have to be Devonarians, but it is a large, multicultural, multifaceted society that contains members of every race and a number of different types of people, and they all are somewhat scattered throughout the place, because during the times when the empire was safer, people were more easily able to pick up, move, go somewhere than it would be now, per se. In the years before the Civil War started, the land that is now known as the Corvian Pale had long been this wilderness. It had been this unexplored region. It was considered very, very dangerous. But slowly, as times were good, the Devonarians started spreading into it, started trying to tame it, started putting down some roots, putting down some settlements, some small villages, some farms. But once the war broke out, and as time passed and the war got worse, more and more soldiers were called away. There were fewer soldiers to, protect this wild area, and that started to feel the darkness come back, feel the wild come back, feel the dangers come back. And then finally, several years into the war, the Bloodtusk tribe, which is this really powerful and bloodthirsty tribe of orcs that was living high up in the mountains, they had a new war chief. he stirred up their bloodlust, and they swarmed into the Pale, into the valleys, and they just created murder and mayhem and havoc everywhere. And with so few soldiers garrisoned there, there was really nothing that the settlers could do to stop them. So many of them were killed, many of them were pushed back. Now, they stopped at the Alabaster Cliffs. That was as far as the orcs went. And so that meant that Sanctum, which has a fortified town sitting atop those cliffs, was untouched. However, many refugees came there. Some stopped there, some kept going. Prior to this, when it was peaceful and expansion was going into the Pale, Sanctum was growing. It was wealthy. It was a great market town. It was a major stopping point for trade before going into the Pale to these settlements. With the war and with the eradication of these settlements, it shrank and it started to suffer. And it was still a good-sized town, but it was not what it once was. And the travelers and some of the caravans just stopped coming. Now things are changing again, because there have always been a few adventurers that have come here at different points, especially when the expansion was going on. But now, with the war ending, people are looking for something different. And there are people who are, looking to this wild region and going, what's out there? We don't know what's out there. We don't remember what's out there. Maybe you had some connection there. Maybe your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather was one of the settlers who lived out there and was driven out. Or maybe you've heard many of these strange legends of lost cities or ruins or other things that are out there, and you want to explore it. And so this is what has drawn all these adventurers. And as these adventurers go out into the Pale and find what they find, start bringing things back, start bringing back stories, maybe find treasure, start bringing back things of that nature. It will be interesting to see how that affects Sanctum and what the townsfolk there think about it, and if that draws other people there. With that said, one of the things that will be distinctive about the campaign is that the player characters are the adventurers. There will not be many, if any, non-player characters who are adventurers who are going into the Pale. That is one of the distinctions. That is one of the things that makes player characters special, is that they're the ones who are brave enough or foolhardy enough to go out into this wild and untamed region. I think with that, that's a good overview. Hopefully that gives you some feeling, some idea about the flavor of the campaign and the world that you'll be playing in. And obviously, if you have any questions or comments, I look forward to hearing them. And until then, let's get ready to play.